Mohammed Shoaib today start new episode. What was going through your mind as you looked at this 5-minute Vladimir Putin rally appearance today? Well, I was struck by the dreamy quality of it. Mr. Putin has this idea that God has something to do with his desire to bring Ukraine and Russia together by force over and over. He asserts that there's some kind of divine or mystical unity between these two countries. And if other people don't see this, if Ukrainians just want to live normal lives, if they think that they're Ukrainians and belong to a different country, so much the worse for them. There has to be a cleansing act of violence which will restore the world to the way it ought to be. So I was most struck by that, by this notion that there's a fragmented world and it's his job as leader of Russia to restore the world the way it ought to be. It's a vision which is quite disconnected, of course, from the reality of the way that Ukrainians are suffering for no reason, and also quite disconnected from the way that Russian soldiers are behaving in Ukraine. So that the country in this presidential rally report today got certainly no body count whatsoever, no progress report, nothing about this is what we've achieved, this is what we've taken, this is what we control, this is how many Nazis we have driven out, just no assessment of the war whatsoever. Well, what they got was a kind of picture about how things are supposed to work in Vladimir Putin's mind. He gave them this sense, this very idealized sense of Russian soldiers fighting together as brothers and being willing to lay down their lives one for the other. That's what I meant by this dream equality. As you say, there's nothing about how Russia is senselessly destroying a neighboring country, nothing about how it's bombing to smithereens cities which are a source of pride not just for Ukrainians but for people aside from this all throughout the former Soviet Union, nothing about how Russian soldiers who were sent there supposedly to protect Russian culture are killing Russian-speaking civilians every day, nothing about the destruction of schools and hospitals, the maiming and the death of children, nothing about what a war actually is, only this kind of mystical vision that by violence he's somehow bringing these countries together. So as you say, it is very striking, and of course the fact that Russian soldiers are dying in such numbers, and the fact that this war is clearly not going the way that it was supposed to go. He doesn't even seem to have a story about that, and no story about timetable, nothing about our soldiers will be back, by a certain time, or that we will be welcoming them back together here in the summer or something. I want to go to what the foreign minister said today, Sergei Lavrov. Let's listen to this. We know the manners and the tricks which are being used by the Western countries to manipulate media. We understood long ago that there is no such thing as an independent Western media. If you take the United States, only Fox News is trying to present some alternative point of view. So Professor, they apparently have a favorite American TV channel. Well, I can't help but observing first of all that Mr. Lavrov is speaking to RT, which is a state-owned, self-recognized Russian propaganda sender, which doesn't even pretend to be an objective source of news, and of course they do have their preferences. Tucker Carlson has gotten an awful lot of favorable attention from the Russian media lately, including official guides to the Russian press asking them to cover and repeat certain language, certain lines that Tucker Carlson originally got from their propaganda in the first place. But if there's something to emphasize in all of this, it would be the work of the few remaining courageous independent Russian reporters, and the more numerous and also very courageous Ukrainian war reporters who are getting us the facts about what a war actually is. One thing that's striking about this war is that we can see it and we can understand it, and we can see that a war from the very beginning is a kind of crime. We can understand this not in terms of the airy concepts that a president gives at a rally, but in terms of the pictures that we're seeing now. A war means the senseless destruction of people's lives, and the fact that we can see this, the fact that is being reported by honest reporters, makes it easier for us to see through that kind of rhetoric. Professor, before you go, we are all sitting here unable to predict what happens next, because it is all up to this one person who's very difficult to read at this distance. You have studied him over years, though, and so what I'm wondering about is Vladimir Putin wondering how long will this go on? Is Vladimir Putin sitting there thinking, how much of this can I do? 3 more months, 3 more years? What would he be thinking about this? I believe that things have played out this way. He did think that this really was a special military operation. He really did think that the Ukrainian people would be happy to have their own government overthrown. I think he's been surprised to see that there's been so much resistance. I think he's having difficulty processing it, because he really does believe in his own story about how Ukrainians and Russians are actually one people. Now that he's been proven wrong, he's in the classic position of a tyrant. He can never admit that he's made a mistake. He has no choice but to double down. But as he doubles down and doubles down again, the only operational choice he has is to kill more civilians, which puts him in even worse moral and economic box as time goes Bisa, I think the only thing that he is wondering is not how this ends. I think all he's wondering about is, will this ever reach a point where I feel that my own power might be threatened, and I think it's at that point, and only at that point, where this war might come to an end, as we come to the end of 3 weeks of the worst war in Europe since World War I. Most of the Washington press corps seems to have finally emerged from a fixation on a fantasy, the fantasy of a no-fly zone, for 2 days in a row now. At the White House press briefing, the words no-fly zone have not appeared in a single question. Most reporters in the White House and the Congress are generalists. They are not experts in any particular policy area, and they have to be ready to ask questions at any time about anything from corporate taxation to health care to gas prices to now war with a nuclear superpower. And so, with many of them covering their first war, it was almost forgivable for the first 24 hours or so when reporters used the phrase no-fly zone without realizing that no-fly zone actually means aerial combat zone, in which pilots on both sides are shot down and sent to their deaths. In other words, trying to impose a no-fly zone in a hot war with a nuclear superpower means war. By now 3 weeks in, reporters using the phrase no-fly zone in their questions are unintentionally revealing themselves to be fantasists. A no-fly zone is enforced by shooting down everything that dares to fly into the so-called no-fly zone, and the aircraft flying into the so-called no-fly zone will be trying to shoot down whatever and whoever is shooting at them. A no-fly zone has never been enforced against any major military power in the history of never. I made that point repeatedly on this program in the first days of the war, and as reality about so-called no-fly zones began to spread, people who supported the idea in the first week of the war stopped short of supporting it in the second week of the war, and more stopped supporting it in the third week of the war, because they could see that it simply meant an increase in aerial combat, which would be regarded by Vladimir Putin as an American escalation of the war in Ukraine. And as we head into another weekend, with the Sunday shows being dominated by Ukraine, there might still be a question or two about a no-fly zone. Do you support a no-fly zone? Is the wrong question. It reeks of a childish misunderstanding of war and aerial combat. What the questioners should ask is, do you support sending American pilots into aerial combat with Russian pilots over Ukraine? The right follow-up question to anyone saying that they do support that is, do you support American pilots attacking Russian ground support systems for Russian aircraft, even though those ground support systems are in Russia? And for anyone who advocates any of this, a question that must be asked and has completely been ignored is, what is the legal basis for American pilots shooting down Russian pilots? Because currently there is no legal basis for anyone in the American military to shoot anything at Russians anywhere, and so that leads to this question: do you support a congressional declaration of war against Russia as a legal basis for American pilots to shoot down Russian pilots? And to any member of Congress, the follow-up should be, when are you going to introduce a congressional declaration of war against Russia in the House or the Senate? Now these are all reality-based questions about the fantasy of a no-fly zone. To ask about a no-fly zone as if it's something that is possible to achieve in the middle of a hot war with a nuclear superpower is the same as asking about achieving a no-snow zone in Alaska. And of course there is also the mandatory hypothetical question about escalation. If the American military starts killing the Russian military in the sky or on the ground, do you think Vladimir Putin will go nuclear with either short-range tactical weapons in Ukraine or long-range nuclear weapons targeting New York City and Washington D.C.? And it's also worth asking that member of Congress if he or she represents a place that is high on Vladimir Putin's nuclear target list. In the United States, the last time Europe was at war in World War I, when Russia was on our side, President Franklin Roosevelt did not have to wrestle with fantasy questions from the press corps, and we were not able to achieve a no-fly zone over our European allies in World War I until Hitler killed himself and Germany surrendered. Well, from U.S. perspective, our President Biden has been clear that we would not have U.S. forces fighting in Ukraine. Having said that, we'll do everything within our power to support Ukraine in their efforts to defend their territory. We've also stated that enforcing a no-fly zone actually means that you're in combat, you're in a fight with Russia, and that's one of the things that we have said that our president has said that we weren't going to get in a fight with Russia. So what this really means is that in order to control the skies, you have to shut down the air defenses. They're on the ground, and some of those air defense systems are in Russia. And so again, there's no easy or simple a way to do this. No, there's no such thing as a no-fly zone. Like a no-fly zone means that you're in a conflict with Russia. So from AU's perspective, where again our position remains that we're not going to do that. Rick Single, what do you see as the dynamic between Russia and China at this crucial moment? Well, as Lucian said, Xi Jinping Is Vladimir Putin's last friend. He's hoping that Xi Jinping will bail him out. China, by the way, is the single largest buyer of Russian oil, more than any other nation in the world, so they're not gonna stop doing that, so they are in effect financing the war, but there's reputational damage to China. Their trade is not with Russia, their trade is with Europe and the West. Xi Jinping cares more about his economy than he cares about what Putin is doing in Ukraine. The reason he's siding with Putin is that their common interest is undermining American power, undermining the American commitment to democracy and human rights. He doesn't want America or anybody else talking about human rights in China. That's where he and Putin have linked arms, but they will separate if it starts hurting China's economy. Music, you.